Honored to kick off today's Courageous Leadership Colloquium and tell you the story of two very courageous leaders who were persons of faith, who were deeply seated Christians, who knew the Bible backwards and forwards, but who were also not afraid to learn something new, and also bought into the idea that God didn't quit speaking to people 2,000 years ago, but that God still speaks to us today, and led these two very courageous leaders on a path to things from very small communities that literally changed the world. Hard to believe, but both the communities we're talking about today, Bande-la-Roche in the Alsace region of France, and the University of Olivet in South Central Michigan, literally changed the world in ways that I'm not sure that we fully take the time to appreciate today, but probably should. So as a theologian, this semester I'm teaching Introduction to Hebrew Scriptures, which of course the Christians call Old Testament. And I also teach a class called Religion 101, which looks at world religions in practice. I have always been curious about where the theological ideas for the founding of the University of Olivet came from. I knew that Reverend Shippard was a deeply committed Christian, but the concept that education for women on an equal basis with men is non-scriptural. The concept that slavery is wrong as an institution is non-scriptural. So I wondered, where do those ideas come from? So I spent the summer doing some research and found the most interesting man who I'd like to share a little bit with you about today. His name was John Frederick Oberlin, was a Christian pastor who was born in Strasbourg, France in August of 1740. And then at that point, Strasbourg was part of the Holy Roman Empire. Today, it's part of the nation of France. He studied theology and seminary and was ordained as a Lutheran minister in 1767. Very accomplished academic career. And when he graduated and was placed in his first church, rather than being placed in a large urban area, he was placed in this tiny, tiny little hamlet called Bande-la-Roche in the mountains of France on the border of what today would be Germany. He was appointed to this community that was very remote and very impoverished. And the area was economically depressed and isolated. And rather than Oberlin throwing up his hands and being upset about the calling that he was given as a minister, he embraced it fully and decided to make the best of what he could out of the situation that he had. So part of what was interesting to me was Oberlin's ideas about Christianity as an institution. So some of the things that motivated him in his ministry were the idea of Christian charity and love. He believed in the Christian duty of compassion and charity toward others, especially the poor and the marginalized. His actions were motivated a desire to live out the teachings of Jesus and emphasize love for one's neighbor and care for the needy. He also was an advocate for something called practical Christianity, meaning that he emphasized the importance of putting Christian principles into action, which is something that at Olivet today we still do. He saw his role as a minister not only to preach the word of God, but also to actively serve and uplift his community. This approach aligned very much with a passage of scripture from the book of James 2:14 through 17 that says that faith without works is dead, emphasizing the necessity of practical expressions of faith. He also was an advocate for social justice and equality. Oberlin's commitment to education for all, regardless of gender or social status, reflected his belief in the inherent dignity and equality of all of God's children. This belief was rooted in Christian understanding of the value of every human being as being created in God's image, not just white men. He also believed in the stewardship of creation, meaning that his efforts to improve agriculture and promote sustainable practices can be seen as a form of stewardship over God's creation. He likely viewed responsible land use and resource management as part of humanity's responsibility to care for the earth that God gave us dominion over. And he also believed in redemption and restoration, meaning that Oberlin's work could be understood within the framework of redemption. He sought to alleviate suffering and to restore dignity to those who were living in poverty and hardship, reflecting a Christian understanding of the bringing about of God's kingdom of justice and peace on earth. There is a Christian movement that comes out of the 20th century later called the social gospel movement. And Oberlin clearly predates that, but in my view, he was one of the precursors to the social justice movement that had a huge impact, particularly here in the United States. And the social gospel movement emphasized that salvation and personal faith should naturally lead to social reform and improvement. This belief in integrating faith with action was a hallmark of Oberlin's ministry in France. And then personally, his interaction with the people that he served had an enormous impact on him. He grew up in a pretty well-to-do family. They could afford to send him away to seminary, and he had a pretty privileged childhood. But his pastoral experience in the impoverished Ban de la Rouche Valley made him acutely aware of the social and economic issues that were faced by his parishioners, and his direct engagement with these problems inspired his comprehensive approach to his ministry. And then he had a holistic view of faith, meaning that Oberlin saw faith as encompassing all aspects of life, including social and economic dimensions. This holistic view was not uncommon among reform-minded clergy of his time, who believed that addressing physical and social needs was integral to their spiritual mission. Let me tell you a little bit about the work of Reverend Oberlin in this tiny little community of Ban de la Rouche. When he got there, what he found was a community that was very remote, cut off from the major urban areas of the world at that time. Remember, at that time, France was going through revolution, and a lot of social upheaval as a result of that, the discarding of all of the system of royal titles and nobility, a lot of heads rolling in Paris at that time due to all that. And I was sort of fascinated by where did Oberlin fit into all of that. And while he was certainly someone who advocated for democracy and advocated for the elevation of those that were in the lowest socioeconomic scales, he pretty well tried to remove himself from the politics of the day-to-day running of France, and instead worked tirelessly on behalf of his congregation at his church there in Ban de la Rouche. So here are just a few of the innovations that Reverend Oberlin brought to this community that were totally new to people at that time. The first one being universal education. So he established the first schools in the region. He emphasized the importance of education for all children, regardless of gender, which is a very radical idea in the late 1700s and early 1800s, at a time when most people felt that women should not require education, and people even went so far as to say educating women was actually a sinful waste of time. So people thought in those days that if a woman was able to read, it should only be for the purpose of reading the Bible, and reading cookbooks, and anything beyond that would have been a sinful waste of time. And so Reverend Oberlin was very much going up against the traditions of the day. He not only believed in universal education, but he brought new teaching methods to education as well. So something that he invented called a reading frame, which was a device to help children learn to read more effectively. But he also wasn't just purely an academic. He believed in teaching young people skills that they could use to make a living when they were a little bit older. And so in a way, he created a tech school as well as other schools that emphasized the classics in education at that time. He also believed in teaching technical training as well. And he also believed that teachers had to be trained. And that seems like sort of a no-brainer today, but back in those days, there was no sense of certification for teachers. There was no sense that people had to go through testing in order to know whether they were qualified as a teacher or not. But his innovations were not strictly in the classroom. He also brought in agricultural and economic development. He introduced new crops to the community because he introduced potatoes because he realized that in a subsistence farming community, people were having trouble feeding their families, and that the crops they were trying to grow were really not suited for the high altitude climate that they were in. And so he introduced potatoes and other hardy vegetables, root vegetables that grew very well there, and helped to promote the idea of crop rotation, which was something that was unheard of to people back in those days in that community. He made infrastructure improvements, organized and led community efforts to build roads, bridges, and irrigation systems, and then fostered economic cooperation by founding cooperative societies to help residents pool resources and share their profits, fostering a sense of community and mutual support for each other. He integrated local industries such as weaving and spinning to provide additional income sources, especially to women who could work in those industries in those days. And then on the social welfare and healthcare side, he created orphanages to care for children whose parents had been lost. He provided shelter, education, and vocational training for them. And he provided public health initiatives to promote hygiene, public health, other measures that reduce the incidence of disease in the valley, and advocated for the establishment of healthcare facilities and train local individuals to deal with those medical facilities. In the area of housing, he saw economic development as a way to uplift the entire community and align his belief with what Christianity involved, addressing spiritual and material needs. And in the area of social welfare, his establishment of orphanages, healthcare initiatives, and cooperative societies underscored his commitment to the social welfare of the community in which he served. He believed that education should also teach ethics and morals. So he integrated moral and ethical teachings into his educational programs. And his sermons were quite often teaching sermons that emphasize the importance of living a moral life and serving others and working for the common good. He created a community of ethics by fostering a sense of mutual support for each other and created a society where individuals worked for the benefit of all, not just for the few. He saw the teachings of Jesus as his model for life, love for one's neighbor, caring for the poor, and the importance of community, all being parts of his theological message there as well. There's a famous story about the Reverend Oberlin that I wanted to share with you this morning. And it kind of tells you a lot about what it was that he was able to pull together in this community in a relatively short period of time. So in the Ban de la Rouge region, years ago, there was a severe storm which destroyed the home of an elderly widow. And when Reverend Oberlin heard about her plight, he immediately sprang into action. He understood the urgency of the situation and knew that the widow needed immediate help to rebuild her life. He quickly organized members of his community and demonstrated his leadership and ability to mobilize others with a common cause. His call to action caused the community to be inspired, and they gathered to assist in the rebuilding of the widow's home. They worked together, providing labor, materials, and support. Oberlin himself actively participated in the reconstruction efforts, emphasizing his commitment to serving others, not just through words, but through direct actions. And as a result, the rebuilding of the widow's home was completed swiftly, showcasing the power of communal solidarity and compassion. This event not only provided the widow with a new home, but also reinforced the values of mutual aid and community support that Oberlin tirelessly promoted, became a testament to Oberlin's philosophy that true Christian faith manifests in actions that uplift and support the most vulnerable members of the community. So here is this outstanding man doing outstanding work in one of the tiniest little rural communities in France. And through an organization called the American Sunday School Union, word of his work travels via a pamphlet that was published by that organization to promote the idea of Sunday school education in what was considered the wilderness of the United States at that time, Ohio and all the areas west of there, including Michigan. They published a pamphlet about his work, and it reached a man whose name was the Reverend John Shippard. John Shippard was raised in a wealthy family in New York State, and he tried to go into the business world, but was not cut out for it. So he went to seminary and became what was called a congregational homeland missionary. The congregational church comes out of the Puritans in England, who then became the Pilgrims on the Mayflower, and who then wrote something called the Mayflower Compact, which many people believe is a precursor to our own Declaration of Independence and our Constitution here. So the Reverend Shippard read this pamphlet that had been provided by the American Sunday School Union and was so moved by it that he began to think about, what could I do with this? And he felt deeply called to create a new college in the wilderness of Ohio. So the Congregational Church in those days had two types of missionaries. They had foreign missionaries that were sent into foreign countries, and then they had what were called homeland missionaries that were sent here in the wilderness to go out and found churches and other religious institutions throughout the wilderness of the new United States. And Shippard was deeply moved by Oberlin, And he was also deeply moved by a preacher coming out of the Second Great Awakening, whose name was Charles Grandison Finney. Finney was an early abolitionist, and John Shippard was deeply moved by his ideas. And so as he pursued God's calling to found a new college in the wilderness of Ohio, he had all these ideas in his head, and wasn't quite sure where they would go and what they would do. But in his efforts to start this school, it was rough. He was literally starting a college from scratch out in the woods in Ohio, and it had no money, financial backing at all. And then came an opportunity. There was a seminary called Lane Seminary that it was in Cincinnati at that time. Cincinnati was just across the border from Kentucky, which was a slave state. And so there was a tremendous amount of discussion about slavery going on at Lane Seminary at that time, with Ohio being a free state. And so much so that the president of Lane Seminary got nervous that the financial support for that institution was going to dry up. And so he made the decision that the students there could no longer talk about slavery, which caused most of them to decide that they wanted to leave and go somewhere else. So Reverend Shippard heard about this opportunity. He went down and invited those students and some of the faculty that were leaving to come up to Oberlin, and invited them to be part of this new school that he was founding there, along with another man whose name was Philo Stewart. So they were the co-founders of Oberlin College. And in that discussion, the seminarians said, we'll come to your new school, but only under the understanding that black men will be admitted on an equal basis with white men. And so Shippard, with this new school, had to go and convince the board of trustees of this school to do something that no other school in the country had done up until that point. And the story is that the board of trustees was deadlocked, and that Mrs. Shippard came with a group of women and prayed outside the meeting where the board of trustees were gathered. And as a result of that, the chair of the board was so moved by the dedication of these women that he cast the one vote that decided that Oberlin would be open to black men on an equal basis with white men. First time in the United States that would happen. Several years later, the board made the decision that they were going to admit women on an equal basis with men to Oberlin College. And Oberlin then would become the first college in the world to offer a 4-year degree to women. Shippard was a visionary. Our histories tell us that he was not an administrator. And so he was constantly thinking about, what is God calling him to do, something new. And he felt motivated to go further into the wilderness and found another Oberlin, and the school that he had named after John Frederick Oberlin in France, from the very beginning, creating this very special school that literally changed the world. And he went off and bought some property in Michigan, and there was a recession at that time, which caused financial support for the school to fall through. A few years later, he came back to Michigan and was on his way to this property, which was up near where Lansing is today. The story is that he stopped on a hilltop in Eaton County, and there were a couple families living here. They fed him, fed his horse, and let him rest. And as he went to leave, the story is that each time his horse came back to the same place. So at first he thought the horse was lost. And then after the third time, he realized that God was calling him to found his new Oberlin here on a hilltop where I am speaking to you from today. He was so moved by that experience that he fell to his knees and gave thanks to God for that vision to create this place, and then made the decision to change the name from New Oberlin to Olivet, which so Olivet is named after the Mount of Olives, and he went back to Oberlin and convinced a group of followers to leave with him and come here, leaving Ohio in February. And after a 10-day journey, they arrived in Marshall, which is about 12 miles south of Olivet. And Marshall was a pretty well-established town at that time. And the stories are that people came out as this party was going through on horseback and ox cart, carrying all their possessions on ox carts. And as they got there, these people came out. They thought to greet them, and instead, what they found is that they came out to jeer them. In other words, they were so appalled by the fact that this man was going to do something that they thought was crazy. He was going to found a college that was open to blacks and whites and to men and women just north of their town. And they came out and basically swore at them and told them to go home, that they didn't want these crazy people founding the school anywhere near them. And that was the beginning of the founding of the University of Olivet. They arrived here in the middle of the winter. Those of you who know Michigan in the winter in February, it's pretty darn cold here, pretty desolate. And that was the beginning of Olivet. Shippard had, as a preacher, had gone into churches all over the northern part of the United States and frequently was thrown out of those churches strictly because his family had a black housekeeper, and they insisted that she sit in the same pew with his wife in those churches. And these were not churches in the South. These were churches that were in the northern part of the United States. So that was the beginning of this school. Sadly, John Shippard only lived about 6 months after he got here, because it turned out that after the snow melted, that they found that there were a ton of mosquitoes here, because there used to be swamps totally surrounding Olivet. And almost everyone that came in that founding party became ill with a form of malaria. And John Shippard was not a healthy man, and he died. So he died at the age of 42, never fully realizing his dream of founding this new school in the wilderness of Michigan. A number of people left at that point feeling like they had failed in their mission, but they wrote back to Oberlin College and sent two very young men, Reuben Hatch and Ormel Hosford, who were recent graduates, who were only in their 20s, and they were sent here to resurrect this idea of Shippard's to found this college in the wilderness. And the story is that Reuben Hatch was chosen as the first president, and Ormel Hosford was chosen as the first professor here. Hatch on horseback went to Detroit, which at that time was still the capital of Michigan, and he went to get a charter for our school. And when he got there, he was immediately met by a state senator who told him that as long as this school had the radical reputation of Oberlin College, he would never receive a charter. So he went back to Olivet on horseback, dejected, feeling like he failed in his mission. But guess what the first thing he did was, when he got back here, he founded a abolitionist society on the Olivet campus, right? And so because Olivet was not able to be a college with a four-year college with a charter from the state, they became an institute, which was the equivalent of a community college with a two-year degree today. In those days, you could become a teacher or a preacher with a two-year degree. So that was mostly the people that came here to Olivet did, until we finally received our charter in 1859, just prior to the Civil War. The very first commencement address in June of 1845 was by a congregational minister whose name was the Reverend Fogg, and the topic of his address was the plight of Negro slaves in Canada. And so what does that mean? Well, it means that not only did Olivet support the Underground Railroad, that was a no-brainer. They were financially supporting it and supporting it in everything they did, plenty of evidence of that. But they were concerned about what happens to these people once they get to the end of the Underground Railroad and end up in Canada. They have to have jobs, they have to have clothes, they have to have homes to live in. And so that's how progressive this school was, right? No other school in the state of Michigan admitted women from 1844 all the way until 1871, when Michigan College, now the University of Michigan, finally admitted women. And we believe that what was then Olivet College, now the University of Olivet, is the first school in the nation by charter to admit Blacks and women to a four-year degree program. So even though Reverend Oberlin and Reverend Shippard were Christian ministers who worked in tiny little communities, their work literally changed the world. And it's sometimes hard for us to believe that, but it did. And because it happened here first and happened at Oberlin College first, then other institutions belatedly began to see the possibilities of changing their lives and their work for the better of everyone, not just for the betterment of few. I have appreciated this opportunity to share one of my favorite things, the history of Olivet, with you. We've got a couple minutes. If you'd like to ask questions, you could put them in the chat and I will do my best to answer them.
Mike, while we're waiting for questions, I do want to thank you for all of the work that you've done to help us understand where Olivet came from, and thinking about the fact that we're all here for a reason, just like all of the courageous leaders who came before us are here in this environment, in this learning community, to do good, to be more and do good. And so thank you for helping us understand how much bigger this is than just simply college. It's been a life-changing journey for lots and lots of people. We appreciate so much your willingness to share that with us today. Everyone, I just put a link in the chat that goes directly to our Leadership Learning Community Hub in Canvas. If you have questions about this topic, about big things that have happened in small places, particularly Olivet, feel free to jump into that conversation. It is listed by the title of the session, and we'll make sure that Mike gets your questions. And if there's specific information that you would like, we can get those requests to him as well. We're so happy that all of you were available to listen to the history of the University of Olivet. We are going to we're going to turn off the recording now, and we're going to close down for about 10 minutes, and we will be back up and running with session number 3. Thanks again for joining us. And Mike, thank you so much.
Thank you, Kelly, and thank you all for being here today. It was a pleasure.